History lied. Civilization was not born in cities, nor forged in the plow, nor whispered into being by farmers taming the soil. 12,000 years ago, long before pyramids clawed at the sky, long before kings carved laws into stone, giant monoliths were raised on a barren hill in the wastes of Anatolia. Göbekli Tepe, a place that should not exist. The pillars rise like petrified titans, carved with beasts that never sleep, serpents coiled in eternal strike, vultures staring with eyes colder than death, predators frozen mid-hunt. Each stone weighs tons, dragged and erected by hands that wielded no metal, no wheel, no city's muscle. Hunter-gatherers, armed with nothing but stone blades and ritual fire, built a temple greater than anything the settled world would construct for millennia. It should be impossible, yet it stands, buried deliberately beneath mountains of earth, hidden as though its very sight was dangerous, as if the truth it carried was too heavy for the ages to bear. And there it lay, silent, waiting, until the modern spade tore it open like a wound, exposing the first altar of mankind. Nothing about civilization is what we thought. The first spark was not survival. It was worship. It was blood. It was fear. It was Göbekli Tepe. In the dry hills of southeastern Turkey, a hill stood silent for thousands of years. Locals called it Göbekli Tepe, the Potbelly Hill. For generations, it was just another rise in the land, dotted with fields where farmers worked their soil and shepherds drove their flocks. Beneath that mound, however, lay something that should not have existed at all. The first hint surfaced in the 1960s, when American archaeologist Peter Benedict, conducting a survey in the region, noted strange fragments on the surface, worked limestone, flint tools, and a scattering of bones. To him, they suggested a Byzantine cemetery or perhaps a medieval outpost. Nothing more. The hill was dismissed, its true weight buried in plain sight. For 3 decades, Göbekli Tepe remained overlooked, its stones resting quietly under layers of earth that had deliberately entombed them thousands of years before. It was not until 1994 that the ground finally gave up its secret. Klaus Schmidt, a German archaeologist from the German Archaeological Institute, had been studying Neolithic sites in the region. On visiting the hill, he saw what others had missed. The fragments of limestone were not random debris. They were the broken tips of enormous pillars. Scattered flints spoke of Stone Age activity. Schmidt recognized the signs instantly. This was not medieval. It was ancient, unimaginably ancient. He returned with a team, and by 1995 the excavation began. What they uncovered sent shockwaves through the world of archaeology. Beneath the hill emerged circles of towering megaliths, T-shaped pillars weighing up to 16 tons each, carefully cut and arranged. Some rose over 5 meters high. Their surfaces were covered in relief carvings of animals. Foxes leaping in stone, snakes coiling, vultures with outstretched wings, boars frozen mid-stride. These were not crude scratches. The carvings were confident, precise, deliberate. Whoever shaped them had skill and intent. Carbon dating of organic materials found at the site pushed its construction back to around 9,600 BCE. The date was staggering. Göbekli Tepe was more than 11,000 years old. That made it 7,000 years older than Stonehenge, predating the Egyptian pyramids by 6.5 millennia. It was built at the dawn of the Holocene, barely 1,000 years after the last great ice age had ended. This was the point that shattered established history. For decades, scholars believed the sequence of human progress was fixed. Farming came first, permanent settlements followed, and only then did people build temples and monuments. Agriculture, in this model, was the catalyst for civilization. Yet Göbekli Tepe stood in defiance of that logic. The people who raised these stones were hunter-gatherers. They had no villages, no domesticated animals beyond dogs, no ceramic technology, no written language. They were supposed to be nomadic bands living on wild grain, hunting gazelles, and moving with the seasons. And yet here was a site of monumental architecture, requiring not only immense physical labor but also organizational skill, shared belief, and collective purpose. The site revealed concentric enclosures, each anchored by 2 massive central pillars facing one another. Around them stood smaller T-shaped stones, arranged in circles up to 30 meters wide. Some enclosures showed signs of being carefully backfilled after use, only for new circles to be built atop them. Beneath the earth, layer after layer of construction spoke of centuries of ritual continuity. Göbekli Tepe was not a one-time project. It was a cultural heartbeat sustained across generations. The pillars themselves were unlike anything seen from this period. Each T-shape represented a stylized human, arms carved in relief across the sides, hands clasped at the front. No faces were depicted, but belts and loincloths were clearly shown. These were not mere stones. They were anthropomorphic beings, towering figures perhaps seen as ancestors, gods, or guardians. They loomed over anyone who entered the enclosure, surrounding the community in a forest of stone presences. The sheer logistics of construction raised questions that still torment archaeologists. Without metal tools or wheels, how did Stone Age builders quarry, transport, and erect stones weighing up to 16 tons? Experiments show such tasks require hundreds of coordinated laborers. For a mobile society of hunter-gatherers, gathering that manpower meant unprecedented cooperation. What could compel scattered groups to unite in such numbers? The carvings on the stones hint at the answer: belief, ritual, perhaps religion itself. Göbekli Tepe quickly earned the title of the world's first temple. Its builders left no traces of daily life within the site. No hearths, no houses, no storage pits, no signs of permanent residence. It was not a settlement. It was a place of gathering, ceremony, and ritual. People came here not to live but to worship, to perform rites, to carve meaning into stone. Its existence suggested that the birth of religion and monumental ritual could have preceded the birth of agriculture, overturning the entire narrative of human history. Klaus Schmidt himself articulated the shock. First came the temple, then the city. In his interpretation, the need to gather for ritual may have driven people to settle, to cultivate crops to feed laborers, to domesticate animals for sustenance during construction seasons. In this model, belief was the seed that sprouted civilization. Göbekli Tepe was not a byproduct of farming. It may have been the reason farming began. The dating of the site was another revelation. Layers suggested activity stretching from around 9,600 BCE to 8,200 BCE. That span covered the transition from the Epipaleolithic to the early Neolithic, a hinge in human prehistory. While the world warmed after the Ice Age, groups across the Fertile Crescent experimented with wild cereals like einkorn and barley. By 900 BCE, agriculture would emerge in the region. Göbekli Tepe stood at the threshold of this transformation, as if ritual itself had drawn humans into the orbit of permanent change. The shockwaves spread across the academic world. Textbooks would need rewriting. Theories about social organization, about what drove humans to form complex societies, were suddenly in question. Archaeologists debated whether Göbekli Tepe truly functioned as a temple, whether its people had some form of proto-settlement nearby, whether feasting and ritual sacrifice fueled its gatherings. Yet no one denied its power. The site was unlike anything else ever found. As excavations expanded through the 2000s, more enclosures were revealed, each older than the next, stacked like layers of a forgotten archive. The carvings grew more intricate the deeper they went. Each discovery only sharpened the mystery. Why had this place been deliberately buried around 8000 BCE? Tons of soil covered the pillars, as if the builders themselves chose to entomb their creation. The burial preserved the site in extraordinary condition, but the motive remains uncertain. Was it reverence, fear, or the passing of an age that demanded the monuments be sealed away forever? Göbekli Tepe's stones now stand in the open air once more, their carvings scarred by time but still vivid enough to unsettle. To walk among them is to stand at the threshold of human history, staring into a moment when people who had no cities, no kings, no written word, raised pillars against the sky as if to defy the silence of the world around them. The shock of its discovery still reverberates. A mound once dismissed as ordinary became the oldest monumental site ever known, older than anything humanity believed possible. It forced a reckoning with the story of civilization itself, and it continues to resist every attempt to reduce it to a simple answer. Around 9600 BCE, the world was undergoing its most profound transformation since the end of the Ice Age. For more than 100,000 years, humans had lived in an environment defined by glaciers, vast ice sheets, and harsh swings in temperature. Then, almost abruptly, the Younger Dryas, a final cold snap that had gripped the Earth for over a millennium, came to an end. Climate stabilized. The glaciers retreated. Forests expanded across Europe and the Near East, and the Fertile Crescent, stretching across modern-day Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran, emerged as one of the most biologically rich landscapes on Earth. It was in this setting that humans lived not as farmers, but as hunter-gatherers. They moved in small groups, relying on hunting gazelles, aurochs, and wild boar, and on gathering wild plants, pistachios, almonds, and grains such as einkorn wheat and barley that grew naturally on the hillsides. These communities had no permanent houses, no domesticated crops, no domesticated livestock. Their world was one of mobility, survival, and seasonal rhythm. Yet the stability of the climate meant that, for the first time in millennia, food sources became more predictable. Wild grains ripened annually. Herds migrated consistently. Nature itself provided abundance in a way that was previously rare. The Fertile Crescent's significance cannot be overstated. Its geography, shaped by the Euphrates and Tigris rivers to the east and the Levantine corridor to the west, placed it at the crossroads of continents. Plants like wheat, barley, lentils, and chickpeas grew here in wild form. Goats, sheep, pigs, and cattle, all animals that would eventually be domesticated, roamed these hills and valleys. Later civilizations would trace their beginnings to this zone, but in 9600 BCE, the people who inhabited it were still entirely dependent on the land's natural cycles. What makes this moment remarkable is how it clashes with the long-accepted narrative of human progress. For decades, historians and archaeologists held that agriculture had to come first. Farming, they argued, forced humans to settle, to cooperate, to build storage, and eventually to organize into societies. From there, religion, writing, and monumental architecture followed. Civilization was thought to be a ladder, each step dependent on the last. Yet Göbekli Tepe stood in defiance of that ladder. It belonged to this world of 9600 BCE, when humans had not yet domesticated a single crop. Its stones demanded a rethinking of what came first, the plow or the altar. The archaeological record supports the complexity of these hunter-gatherer groups. Microlithic stone tools, small, sharp blades designed for hunting and processing plants, were in use. Grinding stones indicate the processing of wild cereals, though not systematic agriculture. There is evidence that groups experimented with tending stands of wild wheat, but nothing resembling full domestication had occurred. Still, the labor required to cut, transport, and erect the stones at Göbekli Tepe implies levels of coordination usually attributed to farming communities. This contradiction is the heart of its mystery. Globally, humanity stood on the threshold of change. In the Levant, the Natufian culture, circa 12,500 to 9,500 BCE, had already begun to show signs of semi-sedentism, building stone houses and storing food, yet they still hunted and gathered. In East Asia, rice grew wild along river valleys, but systematic cultivation was thousands of years away. In the Americas, human groups were spread thin, adapting to vastly different climates from tundra to tropical forests. In Africa, cattle pastoralism would not emerge until much later. The world of 9600 BCE was a patchwork of human adaptation, with no single group yet claiming the title of civilization. The Fertile Crescent, however, was different because of its unique ecological bounty. Archaeologists have traced the earliest stages of domestication to this region. Wild einkorn wheat, still growing on the slopes of Karachidag in southeastern Turkey, matches genetically with the first domesticated strains. The first domesticated sheep and goats would also come from this land. Yet at the time Göbekli Tepe was being built, none of this had yet taken place. People were still harvesting wild grasses with flint sickles, still hunting wild animals with spears tipped with obsidian and flint points. They were nomads, and yet, against this backdrop, they raised monumental stone enclosures. This reversal of expectation forces a re-examination of what drives human organization. If monumental architecture existed before farming, Then perhaps shared belief systems, rituals, or religion itself acted as the glue that brought groups together. At Göbekli Tepe, hundreds of people must have been assembled to quarry stone from limestone bedrock, to carve it into shape, to transport it across distances, and to raise it upright in carefully arranged circles. Such efforts imply not only cooperation but also central organization. It meant leadership, planning, and above all, a purpose powerful enough to bind people together. What was happening in the world around this site highlights just how extraordinary it was. Around 9600 BCE, Mesolithic hunter-gatherers in Europe were creating cave paintings, carving bone tools, and surviving largely in small bands. In the Indus region, people were still foraging along rivers and highlands. The concept of a temple, a central gathering space dedicated not to shelter or storage, but to symbolic and ritual purposes, had no precedent. Nowhere else do we see evidence of such large-scale communal construction at this date. The transition in climate after the Younger Dryas had a direct impact on this moment. When global temperatures stabilized around 9600 BCE, rainfall patterns in the Near East shifted. Forests expanded, grasslands thickened, the carrying capacity of the land increased. People could gather in larger groups without immediate risk of starvation. Feasting likely became possible on scales previously unimaginable, fueled by wild cereals and mass hunting events. Archaeologists have found evidence of feasting at contemporary sites, with large animal bones and traces of consumption far beyond daily needs. These gatherings were more than survival, they were events of social and symbolic significance. Göbekli Tepe fits within this framework, not as a settlement, but as a ceremonial nexus. The Fertile Crescent's position as a cradle of civilization is therefore not simply about agriculture, but about the convergence of ecology, climate, and human innovation. Its rivers carried fertile silt, its hills offered wild grains, its valleys sustained herds, and its climate allowed predictable cycles. But the people who lived there did not immediately exploit these resources by farming. Instead, they gathered, built, and carved. They shaped the first monumental stones in human history not to feed themselves, but to mark something beyond the material. Archaeologists now use Göbekli Tepe as evidence that the old sequence, farming before temples, is not a universal law. Monumental ritual space could exist first, pulling people together and creating the conditions in which farming became necessary to sustain gatherings of such scale. The altar, in this sense, may have created the plow rather than the other way around. By setting the stage in 9600 BCE, the significance of Göbekli Tepe becomes clearer. It did not rise in isolation. It rose at a moment when the world shifted from instability to stability, when the Fertile Crescent offered abundance unlike any other region, when human groups for the first time could gather in large numbers with relative security. It rose before agriculture, before cities, before written language. It rose in a world that had no precedent for what it created. And that is why the stones of Göbekli Tepe stand as the first shock of history, the earliest evidence that humans were capable of uniting around something larger than survival, even before they had learned to farm the land beneath their feet. Beneath the mound of Göbekli Tepe, what emerged was not the trace of huts or fires but an architecture so deliberate, so precise, that it forced the rewriting of human history. At its heart stood the massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some more than 5 meters tall, others weighing between 10 and 16 tons, arranged in enclosures that defied the assumed limits of Stone Age societies. Each pillar was quarried from the bedrock of the plateau itself. The marks of stone tools can still be seen on unfinished blocks left behind in ancient quarries nearby, proof of the immense human labor that carved, shaped, and moved these giants without wheels, draft animals, or metal tools. These were not rough-hewn stones dragged into place by chance. They were engineered, standardized, and set into sockets cut into the limestone floor, each one fixed to stand upright against the pull of time. The enclosures took the form of circles and ovals, some measuring more than 20 meters across. At the center of each enclosure rose 2 taller pillars, towering above the others, facing one another as if in silent dialogue. Around them, smaller T-shaped stones stood in rings, forming sacred spaces where the living gathered among representations of something larger than themselves. Archaeologists have identified at least 20 such enclosures buried beneath the hill, though only a fraction has been excavated. What has been revealed already is staggering. Layer 3, the oldest and most monumental, dating to around 9600 to 8800 BCE, and Layer 2, slightly younger, showing smaller but still remarkable stone circles. The technical achievements are impossible to understate. These were communities of hunter-gatherers, with no evidence of domesticated animals beyond dogs. Yet they quarried blocks weighing more than a dozen tons. Moving such stones required coordinated groups numbering in the hundreds. Experiments by modern researchers suggest that with ropes, sledges, and sheer manpower it could be done, but only with extraordinary organization. Each pillar was then carefully set into carved sockets on bedrock floors, requiring foresight and planning at a level previously thought to belong only to farming cultures and settled towns. Göbekli Tepe demonstrates that such feats were already possible at a time when humans lived without permanent villages. The stones themselves carry the most startling details. Across their surfaces are carvings in high and low relief, animals, abstract symbols, and stylized human forms. Foxes run along the edges of pillars, their bodies elongated and dynamic. Snakes twist in rows, coiling in patterns that suggest menace and potency. Vultures spread their wings, some depicted with human-like forms nearby, hinting at symbolic connections between death, the sky, and transformation. Wild boars appear with bristling detail, their tusks carved with sharp precision. Scorpions, gazelles, onagers, and cranes, all creatures of the surrounding landscape, were cut into stone with an intensity that suggests meaning far beyond decoration. One of the most haunting carvings comes from Pillar 43, often referred to as the vulture stone. It depicts a headless human figure beside vultures and a scorpion, interpreted by some scholars as evidence of a ritual relating to death and excarnation, the exposure of bodies for scavenging birds, a practice attested in later Anatolian and Near Eastern cultures. Others see in it a symbolic cosmology, where animals represented forces of the natural and spiritual world. The meaning remains uncertain, but the precision of the imagery is undeniable. The anthropomorphic nature of the pillars is equally striking. Several of the T-shaped stones bear carved arms running down their shafts, ending in hands clasped over the front. Some are adorned with belts and loincloths. These are stylized human forms on a monumental scale, faceless figures that towered over those who entered the enclosures. They suggest that the stones themselves were not mere markers but representations of beings. Perhaps ancestors, perhaps deities, perhaps mythic figures. The combination of human traits and animal imagery hints at a worldview in which boundaries between human, animal, and divine were fluid. The placement of these pillars was not random. Each enclosure appears carefully aligned, though whether to cardinal directions, celestial events, or symbolic orientations remains debated. Some researchers have proposed astronomical interpretations, suggesting alignments with the stars of Orion or the appearance of certain constellations around 10,000 BCE. While these theories remain contested, they underscore the impression that the builders of Göbekli Tepe acted with intention rooted in shared symbolic systems. What stands out most in the material record is the absence of daily life within the enclosures. Excavations have yielded flint tools, grinding stones, and evidence of food preparation nearby, but within the circles themselves, there are no hearths, no storage pits, no traces of domestic structures. These were not houses. They were not for living. They were for gathering, for performance, for ritual. Archaeologists have found animal bones in great quantities, suggesting feasting on an immense scale. Gazelles dominate the assemblages, along with aurochs, deer, and boars, animals hunted from the surrounding plains. The scale of consumption far exceeds household needs, pointing instead to communal events. Feasting, ritual killing of animals, and the act of building itself were likely bound together in a cycle of meaning that sustained the community. The art of Göbekli Tepe also includes abstract symbols, H-shaped figures, crescents, and other motifs repeated across different pillars. Their meaning is lost, but their repetition suggests a shared symbolic language. Some may represent clans or groups, others cosmological ideas. The carvings are not random expressions but part of a structured symbolic world that bound these people together. Every detail of the stones raises further questions about the organization required to produce them. Quarrying limestone blocks demanded flint tools, hammerstones, and extraordinary patience. Transporting them across uneven terrain required cooperation on a massive scale. Raising them into sockets cut into the bedrock demanded engineering knowledge and group labor. Such coordinated action implies leadership, social networks, and above all, a unifying purpose strong enough to mobilize hundreds of people repeatedly across generations. Göbekli Tepe stands alone in this era. No other site of the 10th millennium BCE shows anything comparable. Neolithic settlements such as Çatalhöyük, which flourished around 7000 BCE, would later show wall paintings, shrines, and complex social life. But these came millennia after the first stones of Göbekli Tepe were set. Even Stonehenge, built around 3000 BCE, appears as a late echo compared to the scale and antiquity of this Anatolian plateau. The carvings of predators, scavengers, and powerful animals suggest a symbolic system centered not on domestication and control, but on confrontation with the wild. These were societies that lived face to face with nature, dependent on it yet threatened by it. The choice to immortalize vultures, lions, snakes, and boars in stone reflects a worldview in which survival was not taken for granted, and in which animals carried spiritual weight. The absence of domestic scenes, no plants, no cultivated fields, underscores that this was a society still outside the agricultural revolution. The imagery captures the essence of a world before farming, a world where the natural order itself was sacred. The stones of Göbekli Tepe, then, are not merely archaeological artifacts but the earliest monumental record of human symbolic thought on a collective scale. They preserve in limestone the beliefs, fears, and ambitions of people who had not yet settled into villages, who had not yet tamed crops or animals, but who already commanded the vision and will to carve their cosmos into stone. The site represents the threshold between the mobile hunter-gatherer world of the Paleolithic and the settled farming societies of the Neolithic, standing at that precise moment when humans began to build not for shelter, but for meaning. The foundations of history tremble at Göbekli Tepe, because its very existence violates the sequence that scholars once believed immutable. Long before cities rose, before the plow struck fertile earth, before clay tablets carried the first words of language, a society of hunter-gatherers shaped limestone into monuments of staggering precision. They left no houses, no villages, no signs of a settled life, only towering pillars carved with animals and symbols, an architecture that belonged to a civilization that, by conventional chronology, did not yet exist. The site dates to the 10th millennium BCE, a time when most human groups across the Near East still lived in small mobile bands. Their survival depended on seasonal hunting, foraging, and the careful memory of migratory herds. Archaeological evidence shows that Göbekli Tepe predates agriculture by millennia. Grain cultivation in the Fertile Crescent would not take firm root until around 9500 to 8500 BCE, with domesticated wheat emerging from nearby Karaködag. Yet Göbekli Tepe's enclosures were already standing, massive limestone circles up to 20 meters wide, anchored by central T-shaped monoliths weighing as much as 10 to 20 tons. The paradox is inescapable. People without permanent homes raised a structure that required permanence. To quarry, shape, and transport stones of such scale demanded coordination, labor specialization, and social organization far beyond what small, nomadic groups were thought capable of. Excavations led by Klaus Schmidt in the 1990s revealed no trace of domestic life. No ovens, no hearths, no refuse of long-term habitation. This was not a settlement. It was a place built for something other than survival. The prevailing theory is that ritual drove this construction. Religion, or at least a system of symbolic thought and communal ceremony, may have preceded the need for farming. For generations, anthropologists had assumed the opposite, that material stability through agriculture created the conditions for complex belief systems and monumental architecture. Göbekli Tepe reverses the sequence, forcing the question: did ritual need to exist first, binding groups together into cooperation, before the invention of farming could even be imagined? The evidence lies in the very stone. The carvings on the pillars: foxes, wild boars, snakes, vultures, scorpions, speak of a world both feared and revered. The hunter-gatherers who raised these images were not preserving daily life. They were creating an order beyond it, a symbolic representation of the forces that governed existence. Such carvings demanded time, labor, and planning. The limestone was not shaped by crude improvisation but by deliberate artistry, carried out with stone tools on a scale unseen anywhere else of the era. The logistics remain staggering. Without beasts of burden, without carts or wheels, the stones had to be dragged, lifted, and set into place by human hands alone. Archaeologists estimate teams of hundreds would have been required to maneuver them from nearby quarries. To feed such a workforce in a pre-agricultural society would have required intense cooperation, organizing food gathering on a massive scale, coordinating seasonal hunts, and pooling resources for a goal that yielded no immediate survival benefit. This effort implies a shared ideology strong enough to compel collective sacrifice. Göbekli Tepe thus suggests that belief could unite scattered bands into temporary communities, aligning them toward a common purpose. It may represent the very seed of organized society, the point at which ideology transcended subsistence. From this angle, agriculture may have been not the cause but the consequence. Once gatherings at ritual sites grew larger and more frequent, reliable food production would have become a necessity, sparking the first steps toward cultivation. The dating reinforces the weight of the paradox. Radiocarbon analysis places the earliest construction around 9600 BCE, centuries before domesticated cereals and livestock. At the same time, evidence from Keonu and Navali Kori, later Neolithic sites within the same region, show settled farming communities beginning to emerge only after Göbekli Tepe had already been constructed. The implication is clear. Monumental building was not an outgrowth of sedentary farming communities, but a catalyst for them. The absence of domestic architecture is equally telling. Archaeologists have found flint tools, animal bones, and ritual refuse, but no permanent dwellings. The enclosures were intentionally filled in with debris and buried around 8000 BCE, suggesting cycles of construction and abandonment tied to ceremonial life. Such deliberate burial may itself have been part of the ritual, a recognition of time, renewal, and the need to build again. Human cooperation on this scale required more than practical motivation. It required belief strong enough to override the instinct of immediate survival. Hunters and foragers who could have spent their days pursuing game instead invested labor in raising stones that would outlast them all. The carvings immortalized animals that were not just prey but symbols of power, death, and transformation. The vulture, repeatedly depicted, may have been linked to excarnation rituals, in which the dead were left exposed to carrion birds before their bones were interred. The symbolism saturating the site suggests a worldview in which death, animal forces, and human community were bound together in ritual performance. This challenges long-standing models of social evolution. For centuries, scholars had argued that material stability precedes cultural complexity. Göbekli Tepe appends this assumption, showing that human imagination may have been the true foundation of civilization. Belief created the architecture that farming later sustained. The hunter-gatherers who built it were not primitive. They were visionaries operating on a scale that rewrote the trajectory of history. Each monolith is testimony to a people whose lives were thought to leave no monuments. The hunter-gatherers of the early Holocene left no cities, no palaces, no permanent villages, but they left stones that stood taller than memory. They carried no written words, but their carvings speak in a language that still resists translation. Their survival was fragile, yet their collective action produced endurance in stone. The paradox of Göbekli Tepe is therefore more than archaeological. It is a reordering of history itself. It shows that humanity's first monumental architecture was not born from fields of grain or riverside towns, but from hunger, fear, and the unshakable need to give shape to the unseen. It was a project carried out not by citizens, but by wanderers, not by farmers, but by hunters, not by settled populations, but by those still following the migrations of animals. And yet, in their hands, belief was enough to quarry rock, to move tons of stone across earth, to carve predators into permanence, and to stand those monuments upright in circles that still command silence. The builders left no names, no chronicles, no kings or gods recorded in text. They left only stone. But those stones defy every sequence once thought certain, standing as evidence that before farming, before settlement, before civilization as it was once defined, there was already something greater. There was the will to gather, to labor, to carve, and to build. And in that act, the story of humanity tilted, forever changed by a circle of pillars on a barren hill in southeastern Anatolia. Göbekli Tepe stands in silence, yet its stones are not mute. They speak through their scale, their carvings, their deliberate placement in the earth. Unearthed from layers of soil that shielded them for millennia, they carry an authority that presses upon the modern observer. This was not a settlement, not a village, not a place where people slept, cooked, or raised children. It was something else entirely, and the absence of daily life. No hearths, no storage pits, no evidence of domestic continuity. Speaks louder than any artifact of ordinary existence could. This was a site of ritual, a sanctuary where human intention turned toward the unseen, and where belief was carved into limestone before it was ever written into texts. The pillars themselves, some standing over 5 meters tall and weighing as much as 50 tons, bear the imprint of symbolic thought older than agriculture. They are adorned with foxes, boars, snakes, cranes, and lions, each figure etched with precision. These animals were not mere decorations. They formed a language, a symbolic system that carried weight in the minds of the builders. To engrave a predator on stone was to grant it a role in a cosmology, perhaps to summon its qualities or to acknowledge its power over human survival. The repetition of these figures across multiple enclosures suggests an intentional grammar, a shared ritual vocabulary binding together groups of hunter-gatherers scattered across the upper Mesopotamian landscape around 9,600 BCE. The purpose of these circles of stone has been debated since their excavation began under Klaus Schmidt in the 1990s. Some interpret the site as the earliest known temple, a constructed axis where communities gathered for ceremonies that bound them in shared belief. Others suggest it was a cultic center focused on death and the ancestors, noting that human skull fragments, intentionally modified, have been found among the deposits. The carvings of headless figures add weight to this argument, pointing toward rituals that linked the living to the dead, binding generations through acts that cannot be reconstructed in their entirety, yet pulse through the imagery left behind. Later civilizations would construct temples, ziggurats, cathedrals, and mosques, grand spaces designed for worship, community, and the enactment of cosmological narratives. But Göbekli Tepe predates them all by thousands of years. Long before the Sumerians raised the first ziggurat at Ur around 2100 BCE, long before the priests of Egypt built sanctuaries to Horus and Ra, human hands here in southeastern Anatolia raised stones into circles with no precedent. This was architecture without cities, ceremony without agriculture, religion before the state. Its very existence challenges the conventional timeline of human development, suggesting that ritual belief was not a byproduct of settled life, but rather a catalyst that may have driven people toward cooperation and eventually toward farming itself. Some scholars interpret the carvings and enclosures through the lens of shamanism. The presence of animals, especially predators and birds, aligns with themes common in later shamanic traditions, creatures acting as spirit guides, mediators between the human and the supernatural. The cranes and vultures carved in relief recall practices attested much later in Neolithic Catalhoyuk, where vultures are depicted in connection with excarnation rituals, the stripping of flesh from bones. This continuity suggests that Göbekli Tepe may represent an early stage of symbolic traditions that would echo for millennia, shaping the way human societies process death, transformation, and the cycle between the seen and unseen. Ancestor worship provides another key to interpreting the site. The modification of skulls, where grooves were deliberately cut into bone, perhaps to suspend them or display them, implies reverence for the dead that transcended burial. These practices, when linked with the monumental architecture, suggest that the builders were constructing not merely a physical space but a symbolic one, where the dead remained present, where memory was enshrined in stone, and where rituals could align the living with ancestral power. In this interpretation, the enclosures become not only sanctuaries but also stages for rituals of continuity, keeping the past alive in the present through controlled, communal acts. The absence of houses is as important as the presence of pillars. Excavations have not yielded traces of domestic life. No grinding stones in context with food preparation, no ovens, No clay floors layered with habitation debris. The people who gathered here did not live here. They came with purpose, stayed for ritual, and departed. This suggests that Göbekli Tepe was a meeting point, a ceremonial center that drew communities together across wide distances. In an age when most groups lived in small, mobile bands, this construction required cooperation on a scale that surpasses what has been assumed for hunter-gatherers. It implies organization, shared vision, and a willingness to coordinate labor for something larger than survival alone. The symbolic role of animals at the site pushes this interpretation further. Foxes recur across multiple pillars, possibly representing cunning or nocturnal power. Snakes slither along carved surfaces, potent symbols of danger, transformation, or regeneration. Wild boars, formidable and aggressive, stand in relief, echoing their role as both hunted prey and fearsome adversaries. The gathering of these animals in stone may have created a pantheon of sorts, a bestiary that structured the mental world of the builders, each creature carrying meanings that structured ritual performance. This symbolic system has parallels in later religious architecture, where animals and hybrid beings served as mediators of sacred meaning. At Mesopotamian temples, lions and bulls stood as guardians. In Egyptian temples, deities merged with falcons, jackals, and cats. In the carved tympanums of medieval cathedrals, beasts framed cosmological narratives. Göbekli Tepe's animal reliefs stand as their ancestors, the first monumental codification of symbolic thought into stone. An early proclamation that the human mind demanded something more than survival. It demanded meaning structured through ritual. If Göbekli Tepe was a temple, it is the earliest one known, predating organized farming by millennia. If it was a burial cult site, it reveals a preoccupation with death that organized entire communities around remembrance. If it was a shamanic center, it embodies the earliest monumental architecture dedicated to mediating between worlds. Each interpretation, though distinct, converges on a central point. This was a ceremonial site, constructed for ritual above all else, in a time when nothing required it except belief. The stones, buried deliberately under layers of soil around 8000 BCE, may themselves represent a ritual act, as if the builders sought to seal away their creation, to close its meaning from future eyes. Yet the soil preserved rather than destroyed, allowing the monumental vision of hunter-gatherers to confront modern history with a paradox. Here, ritual did not grow from the convenience of settled life. Instead, ritual may have called settlement into existence, forcing cooperation, structuring identity, and providing the first architecture of meaning carved into the bones of the earth itself. Around 8000 BCE, the monumental stones of Göbekli Tepe were swallowed by the earth, not by accident, not by the slow drift of time, but by deliberate human hands. The very builders who had raised its towering pillars chose to bury them beneath layers of soil, stone, and rubble. This was not the decay of neglect, but the sharp finality of closure. The act is almost incomprehensible. A sanctuary that had consumed generations of labor, thought, and ritual was carefully concealed, entombed beneath tons of fill, as though its presence was too powerful, too charged, to remain exposed to the open world. The intentionality is written into the stratigraphy. Archaeologists find no evidence of natural erosion or collapse, no sign that the megaliths simply toppled and were forgotten. Instead, they find a meticulous layering of sediment, backfill, and debris that must have been carried piece by human effort. This was not the work of days. It required organization, coordination, and a purpose that was shared across a community. In every layer lies the echo of decision, as if an entire society agreed that Göbekli Tepe's towering T-shaped pillars, some weighing as much as 16 tons, had to vanish from sight. Why would a people who had poured centuries into its construction choose to erase it? The question burns against the backdrop of the world around 8000 BCE. Agriculture was beginning to take root in the Fertile Crescent. Wild grains had been cultivated, sheep and goats domesticated, permanent settlements emerging in places where once only camps had stood. The age of hunter-gatherers was narrowing, giving way to the first farming villages. This shift was not merely economic. It was cultural, spiritual, and existential. Göbekli Tepe, with its monumental focus on ritual rather than survival, may have stood as a reminder of an older order, a world of shamanic rites, of animal spirits, of seasonal gatherings and collective ceremonies. In the new rhythm of life bound to fields, herds, and harvests, such a place may have become both sacred relic and dangerous weight. Some suggest that its burial was an act of ritual closure. The people who had feasted, sacrificed, and carved their beliefs into its limestone walls may have reached a point when the temple itself had completed its purpose. In many later cultures, sacred sites were ritually abandoned, sealed, or even destroyed once their spiritual power was spent. The careful entombment of Göbekli Tepe suggests something more profound than neglect. It speaks of reverence, as if to bury it was to protect it, to lay it to rest like an ancestor whose presence must never be profaned. Others see in its burial the fingerprints of fear. The carvings of snarling lions, circling vultures, and twisting serpents evoke a cosmos alive with danger and transformation. Perhaps these images carried power too great to leave unguarded. By sealing them beneath the earth, the builders may have sought to contain forces that no longer aligned with their changing world. Agriculture tied people to cycles of sowing and reaping, to predictable patterns of fertility and survival. The wild symbols of Göbekli Tepe, predators, carrion birds, creatures of night and death, may have belonged to a cosmology at odds with this new life. Burying them may have been both an act of reverence and an exorcism of the past. The choice preserved what time itself might have devoured. By covering the site with tons of material, its builders shielded it from erosion, weather, and intrusion. While other monuments of antiquity crumbled to dust under sun and rain, Göbekli Tepe slumbered in silence for thousands of years. Its stones remained crisp, its carvings sharp, its circles intact. The same hands that sought to hide it from the living inadvertently ensured its survival for archaeologists in the 20th century. When Klaus Schmidt first cut into the mound in 1994, he unearthed not ruins worn thin by centuries of exposure but a site almost eerily pristine, as though the Neolithic masons had only recently left their tools behind. The backfill itself bears clues to the act. It contains animal bones, flint tools, fragments of everyday refuse, not scattered randomly, but packed intentionally into the spaces around the megaliths. Each fragment carried with it a whisper of the society that performed the burial. The bones of gazelles, wild cattle, and boars suggest feasting, ritual meals perhaps held during the very process of closing the site. These remnants turn the burial not into a cold act of concealment, but into a ceremonial event, a collective action imbued with significance. The deliberate erasure of Göbekli Tepe coincided with seismic cultural transitions. Around 9600 BCE, when the site first rose from the earth, humanity had not yet fully adopted farming. By 800 BCE, the Neolithic Revolution was in motion. Permanent villages like Keonu and Navali Kori, not far from Göbekli Tepe, showed the outlines of agricultural life. Stone houses, grinding tools, storage pits. Human attention shifted from seasonal ritual gatherings toward the endless labor of fields and flocks. The grand stone sanctuaries may have seemed out of step with this new world. The energy once poured into erecting megaliths was now consumed by plowing soil, tending crops, defending land. Yet the burial does not signal indifference. It speaks of care, of intention, of meaning preserved in silence. Göbekli Tepe was not left to crumble but given a tomb of earth. Whether this was to safeguard its sanctity, to neutralize its lingering power, or to mark the transition to a new way of life, the result was the same. A monument sealed in time, locked away until the modern age was ready to unearth it. The act itself resists easy explanation. Some archaeologists argue that the builders wished to honor the site by protecting it. Others suggest that a shift in belief demanded its concealment, that the rise of agriculture and settlement brought with it new gods, new rituals, new priorities. Perhaps the burial was both, a reverent farewell and a necessary break, the closing of one chapter so that another could begin. Whatever the reason, the silence imposed upon Göbekli Tepe endured for millennia, until the 20th century unearthed the oldest known monumental architecture ever created. The burial was not an end, but a sealing. It preserved a moment when humans first carved their fears and their faith into stone, when ritual outweighed survival, when the symbols of vultures, lions, and serpents carried meanings that can only be guessed at today. It was the hand of the past reaching into the future, covering its own creation so tightly that it could not be touched again until the very age of history itself had risen. And within that silence, beneath tons of earth, Göbekli Tepe waited, its pillars still standing, its stones still marked by chisels wielded over 10,000 years ago, its truth suspended in the soil that held it locked against time. Göbekli Tepe forces history itself to stand trial. For generations, the story of human civilization was told in a single direction. First came farming, then villages, then cities, then temples and gods. The plow and the seed were thought to be the foundation of culture. Yet here, on a limestone plateau in southeastern Turkey, the stones say otherwise. Around 9600 BCE, long before agriculture defined human survival, hunter-gatherers carved and raised monumental pillars in circles, some weighing more than 15 tons. They shaped them with stone tools, anchored them into prepared sockets, and etched their surfaces with lions, snakes, foxes, and vultures. The very scale of the project demands organization, cooperation, planning, qualities thought to belong only to settled, agricultural societies. Göbekli Tepe reverses the order of history. The site compels the question: did humanity begin farming because it needed food, or because it needed ritual? The stones imply that belief, myth, and collective ceremony were not byproducts of civilization but catalysts. The concentration of labor required to erect Göbekli Tepe would have demanded not only shared purpose but shared sustenance. Archaeological findings of vast amounts of animal bones, gazelle, aurochs, wild boar, indicate large-scale feasting. Hunters roamed wide to gather meat for gatherings at the hill. Wild cereals, too, appear in residues, hinting at the earliest stages of domestication. It may not have been the hunger for bread that drew people to settle, but the hunger to gather, to worship, to build together. Religion may not have been born in the shadow of the first cities. The first cities may have been born in the shadow of religion. Excavations confirm that what is visible today is only a fraction of the whole. The archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, who first began excavations in 1994, believed that only 5 to 10% of the site had been revealed before his death in 2014. Geophysical surveys suggest at least 20 more enclosures remain buried beneath the ground, waiting. What has already been uncovered, circular and oval enclosures built between 9600 and 8200 BCE, may represent only the earliest phase of a project that spans centuries. The site is not a single monument but a sequence of construction, rebuilding, and ritual use across generations, suggesting a sustained and evolving religious tradition. Each time one circle of pillars fell out of use, another was raised, often larger and more ambitious, as if the act of building itself was part of the ritual. The implications ripple outward across the study of prehistory. If communal ritual preceded farming, then the narrative of the Neolithic Revolution must be rewritten. The first temple came before the first village. The symbolic world of humanity, the need to ascribe meaning, to seek order beyond survival, was so strong that it could mobilize thousands of hours of labor long before surplus food was possible. What had long been considered a luxury of civilization may have been its very foundation. Göbekli Tepe also reshapes the definition of what it means to be civilized. For much of the 20th century, scholars defined civilization by material markers: writing, urban centers, bureaucracy, metalworking. Göbekli Tepe forces a different lens. These hunter-gatherers had no writing, no metal, no pottery, no permanent houses. Yet they had vision, they had coordination, they had belief systems so powerful they demanded monuments on a scale once reserved for kings. Civilization, the site suggests, is not merely the ability to manage resources but the capacity to construct shared meaning, even at great cost. The legacy of Göbekli Tepe is not confined to prehistory. It ripples into the present, shaping how humanity conceives of its own origins. The site demonstrates that human beings have always carried questions larger than survival, questions of death, of purpose, of belonging. The vultures carved into stone may represent sky burials, the offering of human bodies to carrion birds, a practice still seen among later cultures in Anatolia and the Near East. Such imagery shows that symbolic systems about life and death were already fully developed at the dawn of the Holocene. These were not crude expressions but complex cosmologies etched into stone. The act of deliberately burying the site around 8000 BCE preserved it with extraordinary precision. Unlike other prehistoric monuments eroded by time, Göbekli Tepe was sealed like a capsule, its pillars packed with limestone debris, its enclosures entombed beneath layers of soil. When rediscovered thousands of years later, they appeared almost frozen in time, the carvings as sharp as the day they were cut. Without this act of burial, the world's earliest known temple might have been lost entirely, erased by erosion and agriculture. Instead, its silence endured, waiting for modern archaeology to break the seal. The broader legacy is one of disruption. Every pillar raised, every enclosure unearthed challenges assumptions not only about the past but about the present. Civilization is not a straight line from necessity to progress. It is a tangle of belief and survival, ritual and subsistence, ideas and instincts woven together in ways that resist neat categories. Göbekli Tepe's unfinished story, most of it still underground, reminds us that the origins of culture are not fully written, that history retains vast silences where answers are buried. Today, the site remains under excavation, a living dialogue between the stones and the spade. Each new season yields further complexity. New carvings, new structures, new questions. Archaeologists debate whether Göbekli Tepe was the work of regional groups gathering seasonally or a central cult center drawing communities across Anatolia and the Levant. Some argue that the labor of building required social hierarchies, that religious elites may have already existed long before the appearance of kings. Others contend that the site represents egalitarian cooperation, a collective act of worship without rulers or subjects. The debate remains unresolved, but every argument underscores the same point. The site cannot be ignored. Göbekli Tepe stands not merely as the first known temple, but as the first known monument to humanity's restless search for meaning. Long before the written word, long before laws, long before empires, there was the impulse to raise stone against the sky and mark the earth with symbols. What survives is not just architecture but testimony, that at the dawn of civilization, human beings were already more than survival machines. They were meaning makers, myth builders, architects of belief. And long after their bones turned to dust, the stones remained, carrying questions forward across 12 millennia without pause.